For a brief moment, the world believed it had witnessed a miracle. A woman no one expected, standing alone on a stage, shattered assumptions with a single song. Susan Boyle didn't just sing. She exposed how cruel, impatient, and superficial the world had quietly become. But what followed that night was not a fairy tale. It was a long, painful journey few ever truly understood. The night that changed everything, and the price of being misjudged. When Susan Boyle walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, she was already carrying decades of invisibility. At 47, she stood far outside the image people associated with stardom. Her posture, her mannerisms, her age, everything about her triggered instant judgment. The laughter in the audience before she sang was not accidental, it was reflexive. And when she introduced herself, even the judges struggled to hide their skepticism. Then the music began. I Dreamed a Dream wasn't just a performance, it was a collision between expectation and reality. In seconds, disbelief turned into silence, then into shock. By the final note, the room had changed. The judges' expressions shifted from guarded politeness to something closer to awe. Simon Cowell later admitted that he had been having a terrible day and had hoped she wouldn't sing at all. Not because of cruelty, but because he couldn't bear another disappointment. What followed instead became one of the most replayed audition moments in television history. But what the audience didn't see was that Susan Boyle had already lived a lifetime of rejection before that night. She had auditioned repeatedly for opportunities that never came. She had submitted demos that went unanswered. She had performed locally for years without recognition. The stage didn't transform her life overnight. It exposed how long she had been ignored. As her audition spread online, watched by tens of millions in a matter of days, Susan went from anonymity to global scrutiny almost instantly. The same world that had dismissed her moments earlier now demanded access to every part of her life. The narrative shifted, but the pressure intensified. She was no longer invisible. She was everywhere, and she had no protection from the consequences. Despite the overwhelming attention, Susan advanced through the competition. She performed Memory in the semifinals, pushing through exhaustion and anxiety that few people recognized at the time. Behind the scenes, the constant media presence became suffocating. Paparazzi followed her relentlessly. Headlines speculated about her mental state. At one point, the pressure became so intense that she briefly went into hiding, fearing she might lose everything she had waited her entire life to achieve. By the finale, Susan had become more than a contestant. She was a symbol of overlooked talent, of second chances, of quiet resilience. When she finished as the runner-up, losing to the dance group Diversity, the public reaction was mixed. Some felt disappointed, others felt vindicated. But for Susan, the result mattered less than survival. She later admitted that walking away at that moment would have meant throwing away the one real chance she had ever been given. The night that made her famous also set the tone for what followed. Susan Boyle had proven the world wrong, but the cost of doing so was only just beginning. Fame arrived first. Protection never did. After the competition ended, Susan Boyle did not return to a quiet life. There was no adjustment period, no buffer between obscurity and exposure. Within weeks, her face was everywhere: television appearances, interviews, newspaper covers, and online clips that continued to rack up millions of views. She had become one of the most recognizable women on the planet, yet emotionally, she remained the same person who had lived alone in Blackburn with her cat, and a routine built on solitude. The speed of it all became its own kind of violence. Susan later described how she struggled to comprehend the scale of what had happened. One moment, she was an unemployed volunteer caring for her mother's memory, and the next, she was being flown across continents to sing on major networks. In the United States, she performed on national morning television and received praise from respected Broadway figures. Her debut album, named after the song that changed everything, exploded in sales and became one of the best-selling records in the country. From the outside, it looked like triumph stacked upon triumph. Internally, it felt very different. Susan was unprepared for the constant surveillance. Every movement became news. Every expression was analyzed. She had spent her life being ignored, and suddenly she was being watched so closely that she no longer felt like she belonged to herself. The same media that celebrated her success also speculated endlessly about her mental health, her appearance, her behavior, often without empathy or restraint. The pressure reached a breaking point shortly after the competition. Exhaustion, anxiety, and emotional overload collided in a way Susan could not control. She was hospitalized following the finale, a moment that briefly pierced the glossy narrative of overnight success. While official statements downplayed the severity, Susan later acknowledged that the experience had shaken her deeply. It was the first clear sign that fame, especially when unplanned and unmanaged, could be dangerous. What made it worse was that Susan had no established coping mechanisms for celebrity life. She had not chased fame, she had chased the chance to sing. Suddenly, she was expected to navigate contracts, schedules, interviews, and public expectations without the emotional armor most performers develop over time. The industry moved fast. Susan struggled to keep up. Despite this, she did not retreat. Signing with Simon Cowell's label secured her future professionally, but it also locked her into a relentless pace. Recording sessions, promotional tours, and performances followed one another without pause. The world wanted more Susan Boyle, and saying no felt impossible when she had waited her entire life to be heard. At the same time, Susan remained determined to stay grounded. With her first major paycheck, she did not buy luxury homes or retreat into isolation. Instead, she purchased the modest council house she had grown up in, a deliberate choice that reflected her need for familiarity and stability. The house was not just shelter, it was emotional grounding. In a life suddenly spinning out of control, it was the one place that still felt real. Yet even that grounding could not fully protect her. The truth was that Susan Boyle had become famous faster than she could emotionally process. The applause was loud, but it did not erase decades of loneliness, rejection, and misunderstanding. Instead, it amplified them. And as the world celebrated her success, Susan quietly began facing the reality that surviving fame might be harder than achieving it. The diagnosis that explained a lifetime of silence. For most of her life, Susan Boyle believed something about her was broken. She didn't have the language to explain it, only the feeling, a constant sense of being out of sync with the world around her. Social situations exhausted her. Noise overwhelmed her. Change triggered anxiety she could never fully articulate. Long before fame arrived, Susan had already learned how to live quietly to survive. After the explosion of Britain's Got Talent, those struggles intensified. The sudden loss of routine, the crowds, the expectations, the constant disruptions, all of it pushed her far beyond her emotional limits. What many dismissed as eccentric behavior was in reality a nervous system under relentless strain. For years, the public speculated. Few stopped to ask why. In 2013, Susan finally received an answer. She was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, previously referred to as Asperger's syndrome. For her, the diagnosis was not devastating. It was clarifying. It gave a name to experiences she had lived with since childhood. It explained why she had always felt misunderstood, why she struggled to connect, and why the world often seemed unbearably loud. Susan spoke openly about the relief the diagnosis brought her. It did not change who she was, she said, but it helped her understand herself with more compassion. The label did not define her talent, but it explained the emotional cost of existing in environments that were never designed for someone like her. Alongside autism, Susan also acknowledged struggles with depression and severe mood swings. These were not sudden developments caused by fame. They were conditions that had quietly followed her throughout her life. Fame didn't create them. It exposed them. The pressure of global attention made it impossible to hide behind routine or isolation, forcing her to confront challenges she had previously managed in silence. Despite public curiosity, Susan remained fiercely protective of her private life. She never embraced celebrity culture. She did not surround herself with entourages or luxury. When she wasn't touring or recording, she returned home to Blackburn, to the same house filled with memories of her parents. The familiarity of those walls, the predictability of her environment, became essential to her stability. Her personal relationships remained limited by choice as much as circumstance. In her early 50s, Susan experienced her first romantic relationship, a brief and private connection with a man she met while touring. She spoke about it with honesty but without illusion. Marriage, she admitted later, was unlikely. After a lifetime of solitude, she had built a life around independence, not compromise. What made Susan's story quietly tragic was not loneliness itself, but how long she had lived without understanding why connection felt so difficult. The diagnosis came late, after fame had already magnified every vulnerability. But it also marked a turning point. Susan began to advocate for herself, to set boundaries, and to accept that her needs were not weaknesses. When her body failed, and her voice almost disappeared. For Susan Boyle, singing was never a career choice. It was survival. Long before fame, her voice had been the one place where the world made sense. So when her health began to fail, the fear she faced was not about aging or illness. It was about silence. Years of stress, relentless schedules, and emotional strain slowly took their toll. Around the same period she opened up about her autism diagnosis, Susan also revealed that she had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. The condition forced her to confront another reality she could no longer ignore. Her lifestyle had to change, not for appearances, but for survival. Sugar was cut out. Routine became non-negotiable. Gradually, she lost a significant amount of weight, not as a public transformation, but as a medical necessity. Still, Susan kept performing. Touring had always been exhausting for her, but she pushed through, believing that stepping away would mean losing the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. That determination came at a cost. When the global pandemic arrived, her world narrowed abruptly. Tours were canceled mid-run. Isolation became mandatory. For someone already vulnerable to loneliness, the silence was profound, but it also masked a deeper problem unfolding beneath the surface. In April 2022, Susan suffered a stroke. At first, the details were kept private. When she later spoke about it, her words were measured, almost understated. But the reality was frightening. The stroke affected her speech and her ability to sing, the two skills that defined her identity. Doctors were cautious. Recovery was uncertain. There were moments when Susan was told that returning to the stage might not be possible. For nearly a year, she worked quietly and relentlessly. Speech therapy, vocal exercises, physical rehabilitation. Progress was slow, uneven, and often discouraging. She did not share much publicly during this time, retreating from social media and appearances. To the outside world, it looked like she had vanished again. In truth, she was fighting the most personal battle of her life. The idea of never singing again haunted her. Not because of fame or income, but because singing was how she processed pain. Without it, she felt exposed and unmoored. She later described her sole aim during recovery as simple and devastatingly honest, to be able to sing on stage again. When Susan finally returned to the Britain's Got Talent stage the following year, the moment carried a weight few viewers fully grasped. Performing I Dreamed a Dream once more was not a nostalgic gesture. It was a declaration of survival. Every word carried the memory of what she had nearly lost. Behind the applause was a woman who had faced the possibility of permanent silence and refused to accept it. The performance was not perfect, and it didn't need to be. What mattered was that she stood there at all, returning to the stage, but never to the same life. By the time Susan Boyle re-emerged publicly, the world had changed, and so had she. In 2025, more than 15 years after the night that altered her fate, Susan stepped back into view not as a viral sensation, but as a survivor. When she appeared at the Pride of Britain Awards in London with a striking new look, many were startled by how different she seemed. Blonde hair, quiet confidence, measured presence. The transformation was physical, yes, but it reflected something deeper. That same year, Susan returned to social media on her 64th birthday after nearly 2 years of silence. Her message was not dramatic. It was grateful. She spoke about missing her supporters, about determination, and about new projects ahead. There was no attempt to reclaim the spotlight, only a cautious step back toward the one place she still trusted: music. In May, she confirmed what many had feared might never happen. Susan Boyle had returned to the recording studio for the first time since her stroke. She described the experience as emotional, overwhelming, and deeply personal. Doctors had once warned her that singing again might not be possible. Standing in that studio, she was not chasing charts or validation. She was reclaiming a piece of herself she had nearly lost. Despite her global fame, Susan's life remains remarkably unchanged in the ways that matter most to her. She still lives in her childhood home in Blackburn, the same modest house she purchased with her first major paycheck. It is filled with memories of her parents, her faith, and the life she lived before the world decided to look at her. She has never married. She has no children. She has spoken honestly about companionship, about loneliness, and about accepting the life she has, not the one people imagined for her. Her relationship with fame has never softened. Susan continues to reject the idea that success is measured by wealth or attention. Even after selling millions of albums and building a fortune, she has repeatedly emphasized that singing, not recognition, is her motivation. The stage remains her happy place, not because it brings applause, but because it brings clarity. Susan Boyle gave the world a moment it will never forget. But the years that followed were far more complicated than the applause suggested. Do you think true success is being remembered, or simply finding peace after the noise fades? If her story moved you, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold journeys behind the fame.